You probably don't remember the exact year, but there's a good chance you remember the feeling. The house seemed unusually quiet. A suitcase was already waiting by the front door. Somewhere in the kitchen, tomorrow's lunch was being wrapped before the sun had even set. Outside, your father stepped back from the family car one last time. He checked the oil, the tires, the radiator. The gas tank was full. Not because he expected something to go wrong, but because he wanted everything to go right. Upstairs, sleep didn't come easily. Tomorrow wasn't just another day. Tomorrow meant adventure. At the time, nobody called it a tradition.
It was simply what families did when summer finally arrived. Years later, many people would forget the name of the motel or how many miles they had driven. Some would even forget the exact year. But they never forgot the feeling of that night. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, millions of middle-class American families shared moments like these. Rising prosperity, paid vacations, dependable automobiles, and an expanding highway network made annual summer trips possible for many households, turning an ordinary week into a lasting family tradition. Looking back, it's tempting to think those memories began somewhere out on the open road. They didn't. They began much earlier. They began at home, on the quiet evening before the journey.
The vacation may have lasted a week, but the waiting could last all year. For many families, summer didn't simply arrive on the calendar. It was something they planned for, something they saved for, something the children heard about long before anyone knew exactly where the family would stop along the way. A little money might be set aside each week. Some families used savings accounts specifically intended for vacations, building the balance gradually until the time came to withdraw it for the summer trip. By the 1950s and 1960s, banks and credit unions were promoting these kinds of vacation savings plans, with families commonly putting away $1, $2, or $5 at a time. That sounds small now, but that's what made the vacation feel earned. It wasn't something that simply appeared on a credit card statement. It was money that had been put aside week after week with a particular purpose. And there was another piece of the puzzle: time. For much of the working population, a vacation wasn't possible unless an employer was willing to let you leave work and still collect a paycheck. Union contracts helped change that during the post-war years. By 1957, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that paid vacation provisions had become part of the great majority of major collective bargaining agreements. So when summer finally came, the family wasn't simply taking time off. They were spending something they had been preparing for all year. Money they had saved and time they had finally been given. And that made the week feel different before the car ever left the driveway. The route still had to be planned. The car still had to be checked. The food still had to be packed. The map still had to be folded. And somewhere in the middle of all that preparation, the children began asking the question that seemed to make summer move even more slowly. When are we leaving?
By the time the children woke up, much of the work had already been done. The car had been checked, the luggage had been packed, and somewhere on the kitchen table, a road map was spread open beneath a coffee cup, with tomorrow's route marked and folded into something small enough to carry. There was no GPS to tell you when to turn, no smartphone to find the nearest restaurant, no screen in the back seat to keep the children occupied. There was just a map, a pencil, and someone in the passenger seat who would spend much of the trip unfolding it, studying it, and trying to fold it back the way it came. For families belonging to AAA, there were also triptychs,
spiral-bound route guides prepared by travel counselors, with routes highlighted and road construction, detours, and recommended stops marked along the way. Gas stations and oil companies also handed out free state maps to motorists. Then came the food: sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, fruit, hard-boiled eggs, a thermos of coffee for the adults, something cold for the kids.
And the family cooler, one of those sturdy metal ice chests that would spend the next several hours sitting behind the front seat, slowly warming as the ice melted. Food was one of the easiest places to stretch the vacation budget. Families could buy ice along the road and carry much of their lunch with them, instead of stopping for a restaurant every time someone got hungry. Then came the luggage. Suitcases were fitted into every available space. In a station wagon, the cargo area could disappear beneath bags, blankets, pillows, and whatever else a family thought it might need for a week away from home. There was always too much, and somehow there was always room for one more thing. By the time everything was finally loaded, the car looked less like transportation and more like the family's entire summer had been packed inside it. And then came the part the children had been waiting for. The engine started. The driveway slowly disappeared behind them. And for the first time all year, they were going somewhere.
The first few miles were always the quietest. The children were still settling into their seats. The adults were still finding their rhythm. And for a little while, the neighborhood they knew so well slowly disappeared behind them. Then the road opened up. In those days, getting somewhere was part of the vacation itself. Before the interstate system transformed long-distance driving, families often traveled on two-lane U.S. highways that passed directly through small towns. A trip could mean stoplights, school zones, slow trucks, construction, and the occasional stretch where everyone seemed to be waiting for the road to open up again. And then there were the stops. A gas station wasn't just a place to buy gasoline. You could pull in, hear the familiar bell beneath the tires, and an attendant would come out to take care of the car. The windshield might be cleaned, the oil checked, the tire pressure looked at. And the words were simple: fill her up. That was enough. Many stations also gave motorists something that would become almost as useful as the gasoline itself: a free road map. Oil companies such as Texaco, Esso, Shell, Gulf, and others distributed colorful fold-out maps showing highways, towns, mileage, and points of interest. AAA members could go a step further, receiving personalized triptychs prepared by travel counselors with routes, construction information, and suggested stops. There was no voice from a dashboard telling you where to turn. The map stayed in someone's hands.
Usually Mom's. She watched the road signs, unfolded the next section, and tried to make sense of a landscape that looked increasingly unfamiliar. And outside the windows, America kept changing. A roadside diner, a fruit stand, a motel sign glowing in the distance, a town they'd never heard of before. Sometimes the family stopped, sometimes Dad kept driving, because there was usually a destination to reach before dark. But even when the miles seemed slow, the country seemed enormous. And that was part of the magic. You weren't simply traveling across America. For the first time, perhaps, you were discovering how big it really was.
By late afternoon, the question had changed. It was no longer how much farther. Now it was, where are we staying? For families traveling before reservations were as routine as they are today, finding a motel could become part of the adventure itself. A neon sign might appear beside the road: vacancy. the family would slow down. Dad might pull into the parking lot while Mom looked through the room before everyone unloaded the car. The roadside motel had become one of the great symbols of the American family vacation. Earlier motor courts and cabin courts were often small, independent places with very basic accommodations. But during the 1950s and 1960s, standardized motel chains began changing what families expected from a room. Holiday Inn, for example, built its reputation around consistency. Clean rooms, air conditioning, swimming pools, telephones, and family-friendly policies.
And for children, sometimes the swimming pool mattered more than anything else. After sitting in a car for hours, the sight of that pool could feel like the vacation had officially begun. The destination itself could be just as exciting. Maybe it was a national park. Maybe it was a lake. Maybe it was a beach. Or maybe it was something much smaller, a roadside attraction that the family had never heard of before that morning. America was full of them. Some attractions advertised themselves hundreds of miles in advance, covering highways with billboards designed to make travelers curious enough to stop. Wall Drug offered free ice water. South of the border filled the road with signs promising something unusual ahead. Sea Rock City turned a simple geological attraction into a nationally recognized destination through painted barn roofs and roadside advertising. And then came the souvenirs.
A felt pennant, a postcard, a bumper sticker, a little box from a national park, maybe a Viewmaster reel for the kids. They were inexpensive things, but they carried a strange importance. Because when the family finally returned home, those objects would remain. The road would be gone. The motel would be somewhere behind them. The highway miles would blur together. But the little souvenir sitting on a bedroom shelf could bring the entire trip back. That was the real destination. Not simply the place you had reached, but the memory you were bringing home.
But there was a reason these vacations became more than an occasional luxury. Something had changed in American life. After the Second World War, the country entered a period of expanding prosperity. Millions of households saw rising incomes, growing access to consumer goods, and greater stability in the years that followed. That did not mean every family was wealthy. It meant something more important. For a large part of the middle class, there was finally a little more room in the family budget. A little money for a car, a little money for gasoline, a little money set aside for a week away. And increasingly, something that was just as valuable as the money: time. Paid vacation had become much more common among workers covered by major collective bargaining agreements. By the late 1950s, the typical vacation allowance for many workers was no longer just a few days. A full week or more away from work had become increasingly normal, with longer vacations available to workers with greater seniority. At the same time, the automobile was becoming deeply embedded in American family life.
A car was no longer simply a way to get to work. It could carry the entire family somewhere they'd never been before. The growing network of highways made that easier. The Interstate Highway System, authorized in 1956, would eventually reshape long-distance travel across the country. But families were already traveling extensively on the older network of U.S. highways, state roads, and local routes. And the car changed what a vacation could mean. You didn't have to wait for a train schedule. You didn't have to stay near a railroad station. You could decide to stop. You could change the route. You could pull into a roadside diner because everyone was hungry. You could spend the night in a town you never planned to visit. The country had become more accessible from the driver's seat. But perhaps the most important part
was that families had a reason to make the effort. After months of work and school, that week away represented something rare. Time when Dad wasn't at work. Time when the children weren't in school. Time when the family could sit together in the same car for hours and, for better or worse, simply be together. That is why the old vacation stories aren't really stories about gasoline prices, highway mileage, or motel rooms. Those things made the journey possible, but they weren't the reason people remembered it.
They remembered because for 1 week, the family was somewhere else, together. But the way Americans traveled was already beginning to change. The same highways that made long-distance travel easier also made it faster. The Interstate Highway System, authorized in 1956, would gradually pull more travelers away from the older two-lane roads that had carried families through small towns for generations. A journey that once meant passing through the middle of town could increasingly mean staying on a controlled access highway and going around it. There were advantages. The roads were faster, the routes were more direct, long-distance travel became easier to plan. But something else changed along the way. The road itself became less of the destination. Those older highways had forced families to slow down. You passed through towns, you saw local businesses, you stopped when something caught your attention. You might pull into a diner because the sign looked interesting. You might stop at a roadside attraction simply because the children were begging from the back seat. The journey had interruptions, and those interruptions became memories. The newer highways gradually made it possible to cover greater distances without stopping nearly as often. Travel became more efficient. But efficiency isn't always the same thing as experience. And somewhere along the way, the family vacation began to change too. The old paper map gave way to easier navigation. The roadside stop became less necessary. The long stretches of highway became easier to cross. And eventually, the children who once spent hours looking out the window would have entirely different ways to fill the time.
Eventually, the week came to an end. The suitcases went back into the car. The souvenirs were wrapped carefully so they wouldn't get broken. The cooler was nearly empty. And the same road that had carried the family away from home was now carrying them back. The children were quieter this time. Maybe they were tired. Maybe they were already thinking about everything they had seen. Or maybe, without realizing it, they simply didn't want the trip to end. There was something different about the drive home. The roads were the same. The towns were the same. The gas stations were still there. But the family had changed in one small way.
They had a story now, a place they had seen, a motel they had stayed in, a roadside stop they would probably talk about for years. And somewhere in the back seat was a little souvenir that would eventually find its way onto a bedroom shelf. That's how memories were carried home. Not in photographs alone, not in postcards alone, but in ordinary objects and in stories that families told long after the vacation was over. Maybe that's why those old summer trips still feel so large in memory. The vacation itself may have lasted 7 days, but the preparation had lasted months. The anticipation had lasted weeks. The journey had filled hundreds of miles. And the memories could last a lifetime. Looking back, it would be easy to believe that the magic was in the places they visited. The national parks, the beaches, the mountains,
the roadside attractions. But perhaps the most important destination was something much closer. For 1 week, a family that normally lived according to work, school, schedules, and responsibilities had nowhere else to be. They had a road ahead of them. They had each other. And for a little while, that was enough. Years later, the children would grow up. The car would disappear. The old motel might be gone. The road might be wider now. And the paper map might eventually become a piece of history. But somewhere in the memory of that family, the engine is still running. The morning is still young. The road is still ahead. And everyone is still together.